Welcome to Workplace Psychology with Dr. Martha Greidick. I'm Dr. Martha Greidick. This podcast examines a wide variety of work-related issues through the lens of industrial and organizational psychology. And while many of the topics discussed here may be seen as intended for white-collar employees and their employers, in reality, the ideas presented here are applicable across organizations and industries. Additionally, many of the topics discussed here may be applicable outside of the workplace. I encourage you to examine what's presented here, apply what makes sense to you, and simply discard the rest. Conflict at work is inevitable whenever you put people together and give them the task of accomplishing a goal or a set of goals. It is a matter of time before some kind of conflict arises. So, of course, it is in our best interest that we have some idea of how to deal with it. So, whether you are in management or non-management positions, whatever your level of responsibility, whatever your job at an organization, and whatever the size of the organization is, every individual has the responsibility and the opportunity to sharpen their skills and learn how to deal with conflict professionally and effectively. What's important to remember is this, that the kinds of tips and best practices that you'll learn here today will get you a lot further than if you didn't have those. But that's not to say that this is in no way going to replace a good quality training program that focuses on effective conflict resolution. At the same time, one must not use the lack of such a formal training as an excuse for not getting yourself together and doing your part in proper conflict resolution at the workplace. So let's get started. First things first, it's important to remember that workplace conflict is just that. It's conflict at work. It's not personal. So just as I suggest that you don't take it personally when you are engaged or involved in some kind of conflict at the workplace, but also don't go out of your way or don't intentionally make it personal for the other party, for the other person, the person with whom you're having the conflict. So just as it's not advisable to take things personally, it's also very much not advisable to make things personal for the others involved. Keep it professional, keep it removed from the personal aspect. It's important to stay in control of yourself. Stay calm. Watch what you say, watch what you do, and make sure you're in control of those things. This is the workplace. So regardless of how you may handle conflict, how you may deal with conflict outside of work, this is the workplace. You have to be professional, you have to be respectful of others, and you have to be in control of yourself. So stay calm. Avoid behaviors such as gossip or venting or complaining, because those can be very non-productive, and in many instances they are counterproductive and harmful. So stay away from things like that. Remember that this is likely not personal. So not only do I advise you not to take it personally or not to make it personal for someone else, but the other thing to remember is don't get stuck in this me against them mentality. That's not productive at all. Along the same lines, don't make a point of ganging up on someone. Don't recruit people to take your side. Don't recruit people to help you attack someone else or have conflict of one group against another group. None of those things are productive, and they will just lead to the conflict getting worse before it can even get better, if it can even get better at that point. Know and remember your goal. What is your goal in this whole thing? Or what was your goal before this conflict presented itself? That something happened on the way to your goal that derailed you, and now there's a conflict. The other thing to remember is, what is the collective goal, the greater goal, the goal for the group? Getting caught up in the conflict can prevent you from reaching your own goal and from reaching the collective goal. So it's important to remember what those are and focus on a resolution that will allow you and everyone involved to get to that goal. Don't let conflict cost you your ability to get to the goal. And don't let conflict prevent you from completing a task or a project in a manner that it deserves to be completed. Because so often conflict can really affect the quality of the output that people produce, or it may prevent a project from being completed on time, or even from being completed altogether. So remember the goals, both your goal and the collective goal. Don't lose sight of those, and make sure that as you're working on conflict resolution, you keep those goals in mind. Again, this is going back to not making this personal, but rather remembering that this is work. Regardless of what your perspective is in the conflict, remember that your perspective is just that, your perspective. There are other people, at least one other person, maybe it's you and someone else having a conflict, but that means that there's another perspective, at least one other perspective besides yours. So you have to keep that in mind. Your way of seeing the world is not the only way of seeing the world, nor is it the only valid way of seeing the world. So be aware that your perspective is just one of many. This is where you have to be open-minded. Just because you don't share somebody else's opinion or your ideas differ doesn't mean that they're wrong, or that your ideas or opinions or ways of doing things are better. You really have to be able to let go of that and be more open-minded. And that brings me to self-awareness. You have to be self-aware. What does that mean? Well, you have to know what your own biases are, what your own prejudices are. It goes beyond just preferences. You have to get real, and sometimes that reality is ugly. You may have fears or your own agendas that are contributing or driving the conflict. You have to be able to know that. You have to be able to come to terms with that. So all of these tips and best practices that I presented to you here today are going to really take you far if embraced and practiced on a regular basis, especially when you are facing conflict. And that doesn't really make any difference of whether you're in management or non-management. It doesn't make any difference if you are in the middle of the conflict, you're directly engaged in the conflict, or maybe if you're a witness to the conflict. All of these things still apply. Or maybe even if you're a spectator. If you're a spectator, don't make things worse, that's for sure. But if you embrace and follow the tips and best practices that I presented to you here today, you'll be much more further ahead in terms of dealing with conflict at work. And if you are fortunate enough to have some good quality formal training on the topic of conflict resolution, that's even better. But don't let lack of such training derail you or prevent you from practicing good behaviors as a way of preventing conflict and better resolving conflict when it becomes part of your experience. As this episode comes to an end, let's review what was discussed. Conflict is a part of life, and that means at the workplace as well as outside of the workplace. But we have to remember that regardless of what our position within a company, regardless of what our level of responsibility within the company in a formal capacity may be, we all have the personal, individual responsibility and opportunity to make things better, to deal with conflict better rather than to make things worse. The goal is always to be professional and effective in terms of how we deal with conflict. Remember, this is not personal. Don't take it as a personal thing and don't make it a personal thing for someone else. Always remain in control. Keep calm, be professional, and be respectful towards others. Avoid things such as gossip or complaining or venting. They're rarely effective or helpful, so skip them altogether. Don't get caught up in the me versus them mentality, and certainly don't gang up on other people. Don't recruit people to take your side. Don't lose track of the goal, both your goal and the general overall collective goal. Those are important. If conflict comes into play, losing sight of the goal can be detrimental, because if we are here at work to get things done, to get something accomplished, we must remember the goal in order to accomplish things properly. Be open-minded and remember that your perspective is just one of many. And of course, self-awareness is key. Be aware of your own personal prejudices, biases, and perhaps even agendas. As this week unfolds, I invite you to think about how you handle conflict and how you can embrace and put into practice the tips and best practices that were presented to you here today. Whether or not you have had good quality formal conflict resolution training, everybody can use some brushing up on their skills. So take what you've learned here today and make a point of applying it next time you witness or are a participant in some kind of conflict at work. For those of you who are experiencing this podcast in an audio-only version, I encourage you to check out my YouTube channel, Stress Free with Dr. G, where you can find the video version of the podcast. In addition to that, the channel also contains videos that focus on stress management. So I invite you to check out Stress Free with Dr. G on YouTube. The link for that is in the description below. Thank you for joining me today. Please subscribe to this podcast. I look forward to seeing you here again next time. Until then, I wish you joy and well-being.